Welcome to the finance lecture. What does it cost in current dollars to manufacture one functional middle-class household? And why has that number been rising faster than wages every year since 1978? That is the question. Hold on to it. Because by the end of this lecture, you are going to know the answer and you are going to wish you did not. Take a kid born in 1985. American, suburban, white-collar parents. He grows up, goes to college, gets a job. He earns roughly the same real wage his father earned in 1975. Same number of hours, same level of education. Adjusted for inflation, he is, to the dollar, earning his father's salary. Then he tries to buy his father's house. The house costs 4 times what his father paid in real terms. The healthcare costs roughly 5 times what his father paid. The college tuition for his own kid will cost, give or take, 8 times what his father paid for him. He saves at exactly the rate his father saved, 12% of pre-tax income every year. By age 65, he has, in real terms, roughly 1/3 of his father's net worth. 1/3, not because he was lazy, not because he was unlucky. The math just stopped working. Somewhere between his father's career and his own, the equation that said earn a steady wage, save a steady portion, retire with security became, and this is the part nobody likes hearing, false. As in mathematically false. As in the operation does not produce the output it used to produce, regardless of inputs. Okay, stay with me here. I am going to tell you something that is not in the textbooks, and the reason it is not in the textbooks is not because anyone is hiding it. The reason is that the people who actually understand this do not write textbooks. They run capital. They build portfolios for ultra-high net worth families. They sit on the asset allocation side of pension funds. What they know lives in hallway conversations and 10-page client memos, not in the published literature. This is the kind of thing I would discuss with a former student of mine. He is now running an allocations desk at a sovereign wealth fund. I'm not going to name which one. And he said something to me about 3 years ago that has stuck with me. He said, look, the middle class has not been shrinking. The middle class has been mathematically liquidated, and the liquidation has been on a timeline so long that nobody has noticed it as an event. They have noticed it as weather, the way you notice a coastline eroding. You do not see the wave that takes the cliff. You see the cliff gone. He is right. I want to come back to that conversation later, but first I have to set something up. There is a name for what has been happening, and I'm going to give it to you, because if you do not have a name for a mechanism, you cannot see it operating in real time. The mechanism is what I call the Permanent Asymmetry Engine. Engine, because it does not run on intent, it runs on structure. Asymmetry, because it does not treat all participants the same way. Permanent, because it does not switch off. It does not have a political party. It does not have a chief executive officer. It just runs. Here is what the engine does, in one sentence. The engine takes wages, which grow linearly, and asks them to chase asset prices, which grow exponentially. Wages and assets are not the same kind of math. Linear growth and exponential growth are not the same kind of math. You cannot, sort of by definition, catch an exponential curve with a linear one. The gap is the asymmetry, and the asymmetry is permanent because the underlying math is permanent. The middle class did not lose a fight. The middle class showed up to a fight that was, in a real sense, already decided by the rules of arithmetic before the bell rang. I want to be careful here. I am about to say something that, if you take it the wrong way, sounds defeatist. So let me be precise. The death I am describing is structural, not moral. It is not a death of effort. It is not a death of work ethic. It is not a death of intelligence or thrift or any of the virtues your grandmother taught you. It is the death of the math that those virtues use to compound into. The virtues are intact. The compounding mechanism those virtues use to feed, that is what is dead. Some of you, I'm going to guess, are sitting there thinking, okay, but what about the people I know who are doing fine? The lawyer who bought the house in 2004, the doctor who maxed her 401k, the middle manager with the pension? Sure, they exist. They are statistical artifacts of a math that worked for a window of time and then closed. The system is not killing every individual participant on the same day. It is killing the reproducibility of the outcome. That is the difference. The middle class is not dying because people are getting poorer one at a time. It is dying because the pathway from working class to middle class to upper middle class, the pathway that was operationally available between roughly 1948 and 1978, has been mathematically closed for new entrants. The people who got in before the door shut are still in the room. The door shut. Right. So, by the end of this lecture, you are going to understand the mechanisms that close the door. You're going to understand why each one was load-bearing, and you are going to understand why the closing was not a single political event, but a 40-year arithmetic operation that compounded quietly every quarter until the door was sealed. Let's start with what you were taught. Okay, so here's what you were taught, or what your parents were taught, which is the same thing transmitted through you. There are 4 pillars to the middle-class wealth machine. Pillar 1, you get a job, you stay at the job, you get raises that track inflation plus a little. Pillar 2, You save 10 to 15% of what you earn. Pillar 3, you buy a house, which functions as forced savings and as a hedge against rent. Pillar 4, you retire on the combination of a pension or 401k plus Social Security, plus the equity you built in the house. 4 pillars, each one carrying part of the load. This is the standard model. It has been taught in personal finance classes since, I think the first formal version of this curriculum was written by Sylvia Porter in the 1950s, give or take. It is the model that built post-war American prosperity, and it worked. Not kind of worked. It generated the largest expansion of household wealth in human history. Between roughly 1948 and 1973, real median household net worth in the United States grew at something like 4% a year, compounded. That is an astonishing rate of wealth creation for a non-elite population. It had never happened before, anywhere at that scale, and then it stopped. I want to be exact about when it stopped, because the date matters, and almost nobody gets the date right. The conventional wisdom is that things started going wrong in the 80s with Reagan, or in the 90s with the trade deals, or in the 2000s with the financial crisis. None of that is accurate. The inflection point is 1973, possibly 74. The link between wages and productivity, the link that says when workers produce more, workers earn more, broke in 1973, and it has never been restored. From 1948 to 1973, real wages and labor productivity moved together, almost in lockstep. From 1973 to today, productivity has roughly tripled. Real wages for the median worker have moved by something like 15%. Total, across 50 years. Read that again. Productivity tripled. Wages moved 15%. So Pillar 1, wages that track productivity, that fund the savings rate. Pillar 1 was structurally broken before most of you in this room were born. That is Pillar 1. Pillar 2, savings. The saving rate did not collapse because Americans got morally weaker. The saving rate collapsed because the gap between income and required outflows widened to the point where saving became arithmetically difficult for the median household. The personal saving rate in the United States in 1975 was about 10.5%. By 2005, it was approximately 2%. By 2007, it briefly went negative. People did not stop wanting to save. People stopped being able to save because the load-bearing costs, and I'm going to come back to those costs in detail, the load-bearing costs ate the savings line item. Pillar 3, the house. This is the one that I have to be careful because this one is genuinely complicated. In the 1955 model, the house was forced savings. You bought a house, you paid down the mortgage. Over 30 years, you paid off the principal, and the house was a roughly inflation-tracking asset. You ended up with a paid-off house worth, in real terms, about what you paid for it. Plus, you did not pay rent. That model died. It died for a reason almost nobody understands. Houses stopped being shelter. Houses became assets. Specifically, houses became financial assets in a global liquidity environment, priced, well, not literally traded in most cases, but priced, against every other yield-bearing instrument in the global capital pool. Once the house is an asset competing for capital with everything else that yields, its price is no longer set by what the local plumber and the local school teacher can afford. Its price is set by what global capital is willing to pay for the cap rate the house implies. What that means in practice is this. Roughly between 1970 and 2024, real house prices in the United States, adjusted for inflation, increased by something like 170%. Real wages for the median worker over the same period increased by something like 15%. The house and the wage diverged by roughly an order of magnitude. The house used to cost about 2.5 times annual income. It now costs, depending on the market, 6 to 12 times annual income. The math of saving for a down payment broke. The math of qualifying for a mortgage broke. The math of paying off the mortgage and working life broke. Every operational assumption underneath Pillar 3 broke. And Pillar 4, retirement. This is the one I find the most quietly cruel, and I will tell you why. In 1974, Congress passed a law called the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. It is one of the most consequential pieces of legislation almost nobody has heard of. Among other things, it set the stage for the 401k. The 401k did something that, on its surface, sounded democratic and modern. It moved retirement saving from the employer's balance sheet to the employee's balance sheet. From a defined benefit, the company promises you a certain monthly check for life, to a defined contribution, the company contributes a certain amount, you manage the rest, and whatever it grows to is what you get. That sounds neutral. It is not neutral. It is, in financial terms, a massive transfer of risk. From the firm, which has actuarial pooling and access to institutional asset management, to the household, which has neither. The firm could absorb a bad year in the market across thousands of employees. The individual household cannot. The 401k transferred longevity risk, market risk, and inflation risk from the corporate balance sheet to your kitchen table. And then it called the transfer empowerment. Look, I had a professor in graduate school who, when this transition was happening in real time, said something I did not understand for decades. He said, "Watch what happens when retirement becomes a financial product. People will stop retiring on time, and they will stop knowing why." He was right. The median retirement age in the United States has crept up about 3 years over the last generation. People are working longer not because they want to, because the math does not let them stop. So that is the 4 pillars. Wages decoupled from productivity, savings rate collapsed because outflows ate the line item, housing detached from labor income, retirement turned into a risk transfer to the household, each individual pillar broken. The combined load on a 4-pillar structure where every pillar is broken, well, you can do that arithmetic yourself. Before I tell you how this happened, I want to tell you something specific about why nobody noticed. August 15th, 1971, a Sunday evening, Richard Nixon goes on national television. He preempts the show that was about to air. I think it was the Western Bonanza, of all things. And he tells the American public, calmly, that the United States is ending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. That sentence is the most important sentence in modern economic history, and you have probably never heard it spoken aloud. What Nixon did, technically, was end the Bretton Woods system, the system that had governed international monetary relations since 1944. Under Bretton Woods, the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, and every other major currency was pegged to the dollar, which meant, in practice, that the global money supply was constrained. There was a physical anchor. You could only print so much dollar before someone, usually the French, who were always good for it, showed up at the gold window and started demanding bullion. On that Sunday in August, the anchor was cut. The dollar floated. Every other currency eventually floated too. The global monetary system shifted in a single weekend from a system constrained by metal to a system constrained by, well, nothing, really. By the discretion of central banks, by policy, by whatever appeared to be necessary at the time. I want to be careful not to romanticize the gold standard because the gold standard had real problems. It transmitted deflationary shocks across borders. It contributed to the depth of the Great Depression. I'm not telling you the gold standard was good. I'm telling you that what replaced it had a specific property the gold standard did not have. The property is, and this is the part nobody mentions in the standard history, the property is that the new system, by design, generated continuous monetary expansion. The new system inflated, not catastrophically, steadily, about 2 to 3% a year on the official numbers, more than that on the honest numbers. Here is the part almost no one connects. The inflation did not hit everyone equally. I want to tell you about a French banker named Richard Cantillon, 18th century. He died, well, the historical record is murky. There is a story he was murdered, possibly faked his own death. I'm not going to chase that rabbit. What matters is what he wrote, which was a treatise on money and economics, roughly 1730. In that treatise, Cantillon described something that has come to be called the Cantillon effect. The effect is this. When new money enters an economy, it does not enter all parts of the economy at the same time. It enters at specific points, and the people closest to the point of injection get to spend the new money before prices have adjusted to its existence. The people far from the injection point get the money later, after prices have already moved. This sounds abstract. Let me make it concrete. The Federal Reserve creates new money, in modern terms, by buying assets. Bonds, mortgage-backed securities, whatever fits the program of the moment. The first recipient of that money is, definitionally, the people who held those assets. Big banks, pension funds, institutional asset managers, wealthy households. They receive the new money first. They get to deploy it into other assets, equities, real estate, private credit, before the price level of those assets has fully adjusted to the existence of the new money. The asset prices go up. The holders of the assets get richer. By the time the new money has wound its way through the economy and shown up as wage inflation for the median worker, well, it has mostly been absorbed by asset price increases that the median worker, who did not own the assets, missed entirely. Cantillon described this in 1730. The Federal Reserve has been operating it at scale since 1971. The middle class has been on the wrong end of it for half a century. It has the specific property of being entirely invisible to the people losing. There is no villain. There is no announcement. There is a slow, structural transfer of purchasing power from people who hold their wealth as wages to people who hold their wealth as assets. Okay. 3 years after Nixon cut the gold link, in 1974, Congress passed the law I mentioned earlier, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. It looked like a worker protection law. It was sold as a worker protection law. In some narrow technical respects, it was a worker protection law. The operational consequence, though, was the transition I described, from defined benefit to defined contribution, from the firm bearing the risk to the household bearing the risk. The 401k as we know it did not show up until 1978, when Section 401k of the Internal Revenue Code created the framework. By the mid-80s, the 401k had begun displacing the pension. By the year 2000, the pension was, for new entrants to the labor force, functionally extinct in the private sector. So look at the 70s as one chunk. 1971, gold link cut, money supply unanchored. 1973, wages decouple from productivity. 1974, retirement risk transfer begins. By the end of the decade, all three of these things have been set in motion, and none of them have shown up yet in the data the median household uses to assess its own situation. The median household is still operating on the 1955 mental model. Work hard, save, buy a house, retire on the pension. The machinery underneath that model is being rewired, and the rewiring will not become legible for another 20 years. That is the part I want you to sit with, not the technical details. The fact that there was a roughly 20-year period, from, say, 1975 to 1995, during which the structural machinery of middle-class wealth creation was being dismantled in real time, while the median household had no way of knowing it. There were no headlines. The dismantling happened in central bank policy decisions, in pension regulation, in the slow drift of housing to income ratios. It happened at a frequency the human brain cannot perceive, the way you cannot perceive the rotation of the earth, too slow to feel his motion. I had a colleague who used to teach a course on financial history, and he used to tell the students, he passed away a few years ago, so I will keep him anonymous. He used to say something to the effect of, every great theft is a theft of attention before it is a theft of money. He meant that the precondition for a structural wealth transfer is that the people losing have to be looking somewhere else. The 70s and 80s were a masterclass in attention misdirection. The country was looking at inflation, at oil prices, at the Cold War, at the culture wars, at everything except the slow, quiet dismantling of the pillars underneath their own balance sheets. By the time the median household looked up, in the early 2000s or so, the structure was already gone. They saw the cliff. They did not see the wave. Pull up a chart in your head. X-axis, time, 1970 to today. Y-axis, dollars, in real terms. Draw two lines. One line is the wage of a median American worker. The other line is the price of the S&P 500 index. The wage line is, let me describe it accurately, the wage line is mostly flat. There are some bumps. The late 90s had real wage growth. The Obama recovery had some. The post-pandemic period had some, briefly. Over a 50-year window, though, the line is basically horizontal. Real median wages today are something like 15 to 20% higher than they were in 1973, over 50 years. Now look at the S&P line. The S&P, in real terms, is up, give or take, 800% over the same window. 800, not 80. 800, two lines, same time period, same country, same economy. One line is what you earn. The other line is what owning earns. They are different lines. They are not converging. They are diverging at a rate that is, on the chart, almost comical. This is what Thomas Piketty was talking about when he wrote his book on capital. The book is 600 pages long, and the central claim is one inequality. The inequality is RR is greater than G. R is the return on capital. G is the growth rate of the economy. When R is greater than G, which Piketty argued is the historical default, with a brief exception in the mid-20th century, wealth concentrates mechanically. Because the people who already own capital are earning at the higher rate, while the people who depend on wages are earning at the lower rate. Compounded over decades, the gap widens, and there is no automatic mechanism in the system that closes it. A lot of people disagreed with Piketty about the specifics of his data. I disagreed with him about some of the specifics of his data. The central inequality, though, is just arithmetic. If returns on capital outpace the growth of wages year after year, the wage earner falls behind the capital owner, and the gap is permanent. There is no path back. You cannot catch up with linear growth what is running away from you on an exponential curve. This is the surface layer of the engine. Owning beats working. And, this is the part almost nobody says out loud, owning has been beating working in measurable terms for every year since the early 70s. With small exceptions during recessions, when asset prices crash, the exceptions reverse quickly and the trend resumes. So if the engine is owning beats working, the obvious question is, why doesn't the wage earner just become an owner? Save the wage, buy the asset, problem solved. The reason that does not work is the big three. I want to walk through them carefully, because the big three is where the rubber meets the road on why the savings rate collapsed and stayed collapsed. Big three. Housing, healthcare, education. Housing first. We talked about housing as an asset class. Now look at it as a cost. The median home price to median income ratio in the United States in 1970 was about 2.5. The same ratio today is somewhere between 5 and 7, depending on how you measure it. In coastal markets, it is 10 or 12. What that means, operationally, is that the median household, to buy a median home, has to allocate 2 to 3 times more of its lifetime income to shelter than the equivalent household did 50 years ago. That money, the money allocated to shelter, is money that in the old model would have flowed to the savings line. Now it flows to the mortgage line, or the rent line, which is the same money going to a different place. It does not flow to the savings line. Healthcare second. Healthcare costs in the United States have risen, in real terms, at roughly 5 to 6% a year for the last 40 years. Real wages have risen at less than 1% a year over the same window. What that means, again, operationally, is that the share of household income consumed by health-related expenses, premiums, deductibles, copays, the entire stack, has risen continuously for 40 years. The share that was, in 1975, something like 4% of income is now closer to 15 or even 20% for a typical employer-insured family, once you count all the costs hitting the household balance sheet. That is 15% of income that does not go to savings. It goes to the medical loss ratio of an insurance company, or to a hospital system, or to a pharmacy benefit manager. The money is gone from the household balance sheet and is sitting on someone else's. Education. Third, this is the one I find hardest to talk about without getting angry, so let me try to be precise. The cost of a 4-year degree at a flagship public university in 1975 in current dollars was something like $12,000 total. All 4 years, total cost. The cost today for the same kind of school is something like $90,000 to $120,000. A private university is, give or take, $300,000 to $400,000. Adjusted for inflation, the cost of education has grown by something like 1,000%, while real wages have grown by something like 15%. The arithmetic of a parent saving from their wages to fund a child's education, the arithmetic that worked for one full generation, broke completely. So those are the big three. Each one is a load-bearing cost. Each one is a cost the household cannot opt out of structurally. You cannot choose not to live somewhere. You cannot choose not to get sick. You can choose not to educate your kid, but you cannot choose that and also have your kid join the middle class, because the middle class has, in the last 50 years, been redefined as the credentialed class. The college degree is now the membership card. The big three eat the savings line. They eat it deterministically every year because they are growing faster than wages every year. The household ends up with a budget structure where rent or mortgage, health costs, and education costs, current or saved for, together consume something like 70 to 80% of household income. The discretionary savings rate has roughly 5 to 10 cents on the dollar to work with after the big costs have been paid, and the asset prices are running away from the savings rate at compound rates. This is the surface mechanism. The big three eat the savings. The savings cannot catch the assets. The assets compound. The owners pull away from the workers. The workers fall further behind every year. It is the simplest possible description of the engine. It is also, in some ways, the kindest description because the surface mechanism is at least visible. The household can see it operating. They can name it. They can complain about it. What they cannot see, and this is the part we have to get to next, is the wiring underneath the surface mechanism. The wiring that makes the surface mechanism not a bug, but a feature. Not a market failure, but a market structure. The wiring is where it stops feeling like bad luck and starts feeling like architecture. Imagine, and this is going to sound like I'm changing the subject, but I am not. Imagine you have two parallel pipelines running through an economy. One pipeline carries wages. One pipeline carries credit. They look the same on a household balance sheet. Money goes in, money comes out. The household can pay the mortgage with either pipeline, can buy groceries with either pipeline, can fund retirement contributions with either pipeline. So from the household seat, they are interchangeable. They are not interchangeable. They are, in fact, almost exact opposites in terms of where they leave the household over a 30-year horizon. The wage pipeline funds consumption. When the wage runs out at the end of the month, the wage is gone. Nothing is owed. The credit pipeline funds consumption. When the credit is drawn down, the credit creates a corresponding liability. The household has consumed the same amount, but now the household also owes the principal plus interest indefinitely until repayment. Over the last 50 years, the wage pipeline has flattened. Real median wages, as we established, have grown at less than 1% a year. The credit pipeline has expanded at, give or take, somewhere between 4 and 7% a year, depending on the credit type. Household debt as a share of gross domestic product in the United States in 1980 was around 50%. By 2007, just before the financial crisis, it was around 100%. It has come down some since, but the trajectory is unmistakable. The household has been substituting credit for wages for 2 generations. This is the work of an economist named Atif Mian, working with a colleague named Amir Sufi, who looked carefully at the household balance sheet data from the run-up to the 2008 crisis. What they showed, and I think their work is some of the most important empirical work in macroeconomics done in this century, what they showed is that the apparent prosperity of the early 2000s was, in large part, funded by household borrowing against home equity. The consumption was real. The income to support it was not. The gap was credit. When the credit collapsed in 2008, the consumption collapsed too. And what was revealed underneath was the actual wage base, which had been stagnant for 30 years, and which was insufficient to support the standard of living the credit had been simulating. So the second pipeline is not a luxury. It is load-bearing. The middle-class lifestyle of the last 40 years has not been funded by wages, It has been funded by wages plus credit, with credit doing more and more of the work as time has gone on. And credit, unlike wages, has an interest cost, which means the lifestyle is not just funded by debt. It is funded by debt that costs more to maintain every year, even when nothing else changes. Okay, now let me tie this back to the Cantillon effect we talked about earlier. When the Federal Reserve expands the money supply, which it has done consistently since the gold link was cut in '71, the new money enters the system at specific points. Banks, asset markets, the big institutional players. From those entry points, the money flows in two directions. Some of it flows into asset prices, which is where the wealth holders see their net worth rise. Some of it flows into credit availability, which is where the wage earners see their borrowing capacity rise. So the same monetary expansion that pumps up the asset prices, the wealthy hold, also pumps up the credit the middle class draws on to compensate for stagnant wages. Both sides of the asymmetry are produced by the same act. The wealthy get richer because their assets appreciate. The middle class gets a kind of synthetic income, credit, which allows them to maintain consumption without having gained any actual purchasing power. The middle class accumulates liabilities. The wealthy accumulate assets. The same dollar of monetary expansion produced both outcomes. Stay with me here. This is the engine, not metaphorically, operationally. The wealth concentration of the last 50 years is not primarily the result of changes in tax policy, or globalization, or technology. Those things matter at the margin. The primary engine is the structural fact that monetary expansion in an asset financialized economy transfers purchasing power from wage earners to asset holders automatically, every cycle. You do not need a villain. You do not need a conspiracy. You just need the system to keep operating the way it operates. Now, the lockout. I want to spend a moment on this because it is the part that is, in some ways, the most quietly devastating piece of the analysis. In a system where assets compound exponentially and wages do not, falling behind in asset accumulation is not recoverable. The household that did not buy a house in 2012 when house prices were low cannot catch up in 2024 when they are not. The household that did not get into the equity market in 2009 cannot catch up in 2024. The early entrants got compounded returns on capital that the late entrants, with the same effort and the same income, cannot replicate. Because the late entrants are buying at higher multiples with less subsequent appreciation available, what that means, practically, is that the middle class is not just being squeezed. It is being temporally segmented. The cohort that came of age before roughly 2008 was structurally different from the cohort that came of age after. The first cohort had access to assets at prices their wages could clear. The second cohort, in many cases, does not. And the gap between the two cohorts is not going to close because there is no mechanism inside the system that closes it. Wages would have to grow faster than assets for a sustained period. Wages have not done that for 50 years. There is no evidence they are about to start. So the question, and this is the question I want you to walk out of this lecture holding, is not whether the middle class is mathematically dead. The question is what replaces it? What does a society look like when its middle class is gone? What political structures emerge? What social structures emerge? What asset class becomes the new battleground, the new gateway, the new lock? I have some thoughts on that. The conversation about what comes next involves the role of housing as a financialized asset class at industrial scale. It involves the rise of fractional and corporate ownership models. It involves what artificial intelligence does to the white-collar wage premium that was, for a brief window, the last available escape route. It involves the political response to a generation that has done everything it was told to do and ended up with 1/3 of its parents' net worth. But that is its own conversation, and it will have to wait. For now, I want you to leave with one thing. The middle class did not die because of a single decision or a single policy or a single villain. It died because the arithmetic that produced it required a specific set of structural conditions: wages, tracking productivity, monetary expansion benefiting workers, assets priced by local incomes, retirement funded by employers. And every one of those conditions was quietly disassembled over roughly half a century in a sequence so slow that no generation alive could perceive it as an event. You have just perceived it as an event. What you do with that? Well, that part has not been written yet.